All right, guys. So in this video, I wanted to go over a meet recap of my client Oscar. So Oscar is 17 years old. He lives in Sweden. We've been working together since he was 14 years old, so about 3 years at this point. And Oscar actually just became a national champion in Sweden in the 74 kilo class with a 197.5 kg squat, which in American freedom units, that's 435 pounds, a 125 kilo bench press. I believe that's 275 and freedom units, and then a 270 kilo deadlift, which is going to be 5,995. And again, he's 17 years old at 74 kilos or 163 pounds, which is pretty crazy. Obviously, like the squat was actually a lot easier than we were both expecting. 197.5 was the top end of his range. It's pretty clear that he had like 200 kilos or more. Again, really, really great execution on Oscar's part. Looked like a second attempt, to be honest with you. I think he probably had about 205 on the day, 125 kilo bench press, so yeah, 275. Probably had around 127.5, 130. Oscar's bench is fast until it's not. And then 270 kilo deadlift, which was really, really good. And this is a really big deadlift for us too, especially because he's hit really big. He's hit like 280 with straps, but grip has always been his limiting factor. And this was a super smooth deadlift. He probably had another 2.5 kilos on his deadlift, but 17 years old, pretty crazy. So like what he said in his caption, this prep going into this competition was really weird. He was struggling with injuries quite a bit with his adductor. He got sick, and it really made us completely strip back his programming. You could look at what we were doing before. I was going to pull up his program So you kind of see right here what we were sort of trying to do initially. Oscar responds really well to higher volume benching, and for some reason, his bench press only sort of responds to 1 to 5 reps on most days. We've had just a lot of data on that. I'm not sure why some people just respond better to lower average reps and whatever. I think it has maybe just to do with where the intensity zone is, where people make the most adaptations in, is my main assumption as to why we see that with people like Oscar, for example. I see it only as PRS performance as a hypothesis has to do with range of motion. I am less prone to believe that. I've seen people with longer ranges of motion that respond better to higher reps, whereas in his videos, he thinks that they respond better to lower reps. And I think that's could be true for some people, but I think this has to do with just the overall loading zone for that person. And if you think about that's the main use of reps is that we're going to alter the loading zone that you can use in terms of percentage of one or a max. So bench press was pretty straightforward. We didn't really change much throughout the entire prep. Just kind of slowly chipping away with 4 times a week. All that we did was we just add in. He did a compete equipped on bench press, but fun fact, he basically won a Equip Nationals competing raw on squat and deadlift, which is nuts, and then only using a shirt for bench press. So we just add in one single for his bench press, basically one raw and then one equipped throughout the entire one. We had one higher volume but bench day just for a different novel stiff stimulus going into the meets, and then just getting them just a little bit more volume as things were sort of slowing down a little bit with things within the 1 to 5 approach. And really, this is when I would use strategic variation with either repetitions, exercise, something like that, without altering the training microcycle going into a meet, because that's what mostly matters. We want to keep the same integrity of a microcycle, unless there's some sort of scheduling conflict. Which, if you do look at this, we did sort of change things a little bit because of the scheduling for Oscar, which is what we had to do, and just to allow for him to feel a little bit better on his squats. But the main reason why a lot of people have higher frequency bench presses is because bench operates on a shorter microcycle. It's a period of time that you have between your peak intensity exposure and your primary session would be your secondary session or your tertiary. And that's why we sort of have, it's about a 3.5 day microcycle for Oscar's bench press. Top set right here, basically 3.5 days more or less, whereas his squat is a week and his deadlift is a week. But you're trying to push Oscar had adductor issues. We were trying to push sumo twice a week, as well as squats twice a week. And that just wasn't really working out for him. He kept getting his adductor aggravated. He kept getting issues with this, and we don't really know why did this happen. We didn't have a really sharp increase in training volume. We didn't have a sharp increase in load, but the reality is that injuries are sometimes a part of the training process. I mean, you need to know how to navigate that. So if you look at this, basically you're going from like, 2 times a week for frequency of squat and deadlift on this one, we went to having to basically do hack squats for a secondary day, a little bit heavier, and then RDLs to get in some hinging volume and make sure we're getting some sort of stimulus so that we could basically try and bridge that exposure on his deadlift and his squat to train those muscles that you didn't want to feel like flat or lagging coming into his session, or basically, you feel fresh, but the weight feels really, really heavy. And basically because he was dealing with an injury, but we also knew he wanted to go into a prep for a meet. Basically what I decided to do is give him a fatigue single for the majority of the prep with the exception of week 5, along with a linear periodization downwards of reps to increase intensity slowly without increasing stimulus. We also use pause squats and pause deadlifts to limit the load on his squats and help him a little bit more focus on his positioning on both squat and on deadlift. It worked out like really, really, really well. He was able to get stronger throughout the entire process, didn't get weaker at all. And all that we did is basically we were like, okay, cool, like we're just going to keep a single at 6 to 7 for the majority of the prep, and then flip that on the last week to have a single right there, again with a linear periodization downward of repetitions, keeping the paused scheme on his down sets, and that's sort of like what we did. We also still kept, again, half squat in on the other day. Just a slight reduction in repetitions to increase intensity without going over the intensity threshold that I wanted to go over on for secondary day on a half squat. Same thing with like RDL, but this worked really, really, really well for him. Came in basically the strongest he had ever felt on squat and on deadlift. And this sort of tells us that Oscar doesn't need a ton of higher intensity exposure, a higher volume to like make progress on his squats. And it seems that as long as he feels good going into his sessions, that's what mostly matters. And basically Oscar responds a little better having his secondary squat a little bit closer to his primary squat, just because my assumption there with that is that he probably just feels like he's better able to feel his quads, that we're aware of them, and less like a lag in technique with that. Whereas with the deadlift, it's like he actually operates a little bit better with a little bit more of having his secondary day a little bit more close to his primary day and having more space in between his primary and secondary day. That's because he's a really good deadlifter. He's quite strong for his weight. Also, the squats are kind of in between that to sort of bridge that anyways. And deadlift tends to feel a little bit better, a little bit more fresh. But you can sort of see a little bit of a shorter microcycle length between his secondary day and his primary day on squats, and a longer one between his secondary day and his primary day on deadlift. Whenever we're basically looking over a training program, we want to look at that preceding stimulus to whatever session we're expecting to be strong, and in turn determining, okay, well, like what do we need to do to make sure that day that we're expecting to be strong is strongest. And for some people that means more volume. For some people that means they need more intensity exposure. You really just have to pay attention to how the lifter subjectively and objectively feels. This is where lifter communication comes into play. For his taper, really we found that we don't need to really taper his bench that much. Very small reduction in volume and intensity the week of, really just the slower the rep, maintain sets, maintain intensity. But basically super cut is deadlift and super cut is squat. It's really, really light single work, just to maintain some technical proficiency and some peak intensity stimulus. Because whenever we are tapering, we mostly want to lower down volume while maintaining a certain level of intensity to maintain that neurological effect and that exposure to heavy stimulus. Because lots of times people in tapers, they will just completely stop lifting heavy and not do much volume. And you want to, typically for a taper, anywhere around it's going to be anywhere between like 50 to 70% of like normal training volume on average. But that's such a wide range. Like on bench press, for example, like it's like a 90% reduction. Like the squat and deadlift, it's like over like 50%. If you look at it, it's like it's also including like how much do we taper accessories for the lifter going into that week. And really because we didn't really need to really keep those in. Oscar was also starting to feel a little bit sick, so I just decided to like really reduce down the intensity on that. And overall, the result was at all-time PRs on everything. It's a very strong day, and he's just he's only 17 years old and freaking super strong. So we're really excited to see what happens there, and just looking forward as his future training. We're going back to the other split that we were doing just before because he felt a little bit better with that. Objectively is what he said, and then we are experimenting a little bit more with having some more frequent exposure to squat and deadlift. If it doesn't work well though, we're just going to go back to a similar structure. Also, we keep getting in heavy holds on with the bar, like 100 to 110% of his max has really helped out his deadlift grip strength a ton, as well as changing how he's gripped the bar, basically having the bar be a little bit lower in his not a little bit, but lower, having a little bit more higher in his hands because it tends to roll in Oscar's hands just a little bit, just by how explosive he is off the floor. That's one of the things that we started to do with his grip. But overall, this is what we're sort of doing with his training programming going forward. Again, keeping a similar structure, but slightly more intensity exposure across the training week. Because it's essentially, the more often we can find ways to sneak in that peak intensity exposure, for lack of a better term, the stronger we're probably going to be able to get in the long run. So, yeah, and you also see like accessories are, and like on all my programs, like accessories are just as much of a part of the main training stimulus as the heavy day. Just for example, when we're talking about distributing the training stimulus and adding in accessories, if I'm doing a secondary day and if we're going into a primary day, I don't want to have a lot of lengthened positions on the accessories because that's going to result in a little bit more soreness, a little more time for like fatigue. Because Oscar already gets rather sore in his adductors. Like squats and deadlifts are really, really similar of his adductors. You can see except my accessories for him are just leg extensions for his quads, along the half squat. That's what's a part of like the squat volume itself. But it's mostly just leg extensions. You can see, that allows for him to recover a little bit faster. You can also see there's a little bit more use of, shorter positions on, he has like a back-to-back bench day or whatever. That's just a way to like basically incorporate accessories in your program without interfering with the main outcome you want to have, which is going to be strength gain. So yeah, hopefully this makes sense to you guys. And again, keeping in singles because, coming into a nationals prep and a team nationals prep in December. And for most powerlifters, I like to keep seeing singles a little bit longer, as long as they're not feeling stale. They are still like, they're having the joint issues from it. They know how to actually execute singles properly in terms of knowing how, what bar speed correlates to RP6 and stuff like that. So yeah, man, hopefully this made sense. If you guys are interested in coaching, links down for applying are below. And if you guys want to follow Oscar, just Oscar Berg on Instagram. Yeah, really proud of him.